We're finishing up chapter 9 tonight, so we just have a few verses left. And but just by way of review, we can just look at these chapter reviews. Sometimes it's kind of nice. I like to kind of see it in the sequence, what the chapters we've gone over. The first two chapters that are yet to be uploaded, basically where I'm showing that there was one church. There's lots of details, but it's especially important, I think, to bring out the scripture that we're missing today. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote this letter for what they were missing. And so in this epistle, we have things today that the people of God have lost, dropped, or ignored. And so we need to teach it. It needs to be our attitude and pursue it as much as we can. In the first chapter, we see that there was one church in every city. Not churches, but only a single church in every city with a single group of leadership in each city. And of course, the one message to determine to know nothing but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Chapter 3 talks about how mature the believers were and shows again the one church model and really shows what we've got in Christ. How really everything belongs to us believers, so we shouldn't be divisive. The spiritual leaders all belong to us. And everything God's going to give us in the world. Chapter 4 talks about spiritual leaders, how they can be, how they need to not worry about really what others think. All spiritual leaders will be slandered and condemned, and the Apostle Paul was, of course Jesus was, every prophet of old was. There's no exception to that. And Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, he said that I don't consider this as any problem because it's God who judges me, not man. And we see how it was wrong to be extra scriptural and to follow only Paul's example. This is kind of interesting a lot today to say, well, Paul's an apostle, we can't do what he did. But by revelation, the Bible tells us many places to follow his example, even as he follows the example of Jesus. In fact, we should not only follow Paul's example, we should follow Jesus' example. Chapter 5, Christ demands every believer to clean up his church. This was not written to elders. This was written to all the believers. And he tells all the believers to be a part of making the church holy and to be righteous. Chapter 6, we see that should be no civil lawsuits with believers, and that our physical body even belongs to Christ. Chapter 7, he goes into sex, singles, marriage, divorce, and calling, and there's a lot that is in that chapter. We won't review it all today other than to say that there's something in there for every person, and especially today in today's decadent society. Chapter 7 is really important for specific instruction. Chapter 8, he talks about having liberty, and your liberty, you may have knowledge and you may have liberty, but your knowledge and your liberty can destroy people. It says only love builds. So in chapter 8 we looked at that, seeing even if you have right knowledge and you have biblical liberty, you can use that knowledge and that liberty to really undermine and to destroy Christians. But only love builds up. And of course the key verse to that is knowledge puffs up, makes somebody proud, but love builds up. And then chapter 9, we saw the credential for apostles. What was the single credential for an apostle or missionary, which is the same word as apostle, which is what?
Character.
No.
Missionary.
Same word as missionary. But what was the credential that he gave, the fundamental credential of his apostleship?
To see Christ, have seen Christ.
No.
His fruit.
A lot of people saw Jesus that were not apostles.
Those are people that got saved.
People that got saved, yeah. He was like a spiritual father. So, there's some fathers that are better than other fathers, but just as there were some apostles that worked harder than others. But the credential for an apostle is if they saw people saved and built a church. Talked about their pay, and it finally concludes with how you and we can be winners. And so this is what we're going to conclude on in the last few verses here, and how to be winners. We looked at some of this. Maybe we'll just review a little bit of this, and then we'll go into the last few verses. And some of you might have thoughts or questions or comments that you can make on this. I titled this in my paraphrase, How to Always Win People. And we touched on this before. It's chapter 9 in 1 Corinthians. So I'm totally free and not bound to anyone. Nevertheless, I've chosen to put myself in bondage under everyone, to be everyone's slave, so that I might win everyone. And we looked at the thought that really that's, if you want to get through to somebody, just serve them. If you be somebody's slave, somebody's servant, everybody loves somebody that serves them. And in fact, Jesus said, remember, he said that the credentials, the person that will be the chiefest of everybody is who? The least? Well, that's true, but he gave a specific word. Whoever will be the chiefest will be the servant of all. So in the New Testament, contrary to the world, in the world, we try to get ahead, don't we? Jesus said, my leaders will try to get, like Lauren said, become the least, to become the servant. And whoever serves the most is the leader. So Jesus said that. You may not think so, but in Jesus' economy, whoever serves the most is the leader. And you'll really have the most influence. You don't have the most influence by knowing more, but by serving more, which is kind of cool because, if we had to know the most, be a leader to know the most, then, some people that had the highest IQ might know the most. But any of us can serve. Any of us can go down. It's hard to go up, but we can all go down, can't we? Which is really cool, I think. And then these are the 4 categories of people that Paul said a mature person won't try to assert how they are, but they will identify with whoever they're with. This is how we win people. And the first one was Jews. He said, when I'm with the Jews, I'm just like a Jew, so I can win more Jews. Well, a lot of us would think, I don't want to be like the Jews. They're legalistic. They follow the law. They feel they're under the law. And really the law wasn't the Mosaic law. It was really the Jewish traditional law in many instances. So they added a lot of things that were very legalistic. We might say, I'm not that. I'm free, as we read here in the scripture. I have liberty in Christ. But Paul said, if you want to win somebody, you have to be like them. So there's the Jews that were very legalistic. And Paul came under and really followed their traditions. Remember when he was going into Jerusalem, he had Titus cut his hair. He himself went and cut his hair to have the hair identify his haircut with the Jews there in Jerusalem. And we many times dress and cut our hair to try to have self-identity. Paul tried to identify with whoever he was with. It didn't matter whether it was his clothes, whether it was his hair, whether it was his food, whatever he did. However you are, I want to be like you because I want to win you. So when we don't have that attitude, we're really putting ourselves above what the Apostle Paul even put himself as. So we see that Paul did that. He became like the Jews. And here's a second category titled Judaized Gentiles. There were Gentiles that were not Jews by birth, but they were very legalistic. And they followed all these traditions as well. And we see this in verse 20. He says, when I'm with the Gentiles who are following Jewish law, I follow Jewish law. Though I don't have to follow it, I do so that I might win more of these Judaized Gentiles. That's incredible. Keep going. 21. Here's the third category of individuals. And this will cover every individual in the world because Paul wanted to reach everybody in the world. Verse 21, lawless Gentiles. So there were Gentiles that were very like the Jews. They had all these laws and traditions and were very, at least outwardly moral, though many times inwardly they were not moral. But then you had the Gentiles, and these were like Scythians or barbarians. They were really crude. Sometimes they were dirty people. And it's some people that were brought up in a very clean environment, a very moral, high standard environment. you wouldn't want to identify with the lawless, the barbaric Gentiles. They were very crude. But Paul said, when I'm with Gentiles who do not know or follow God's law. Now look, if you don't know or you don't follow God's law, that's a bad bunch of people to be around. Paul said, I live like them so I can win more of these lawless Gentiles. But he has this little disclaimer. I do not violate God's law, which is Christ's law. So he would be like the lawless. He would be identified with them, except he wouldn't violate the law of God, which is obviously important. So, and this shows the principle with whatever we do, whoever we identify with, we should be willing to change anything about us except violating God's law. And by the way, this verse, I think, shows that God's law, the Mosaic law, is synonymous with Christ's law. Some people try to say, well, the law in the Old Testament is one thing, the law in the New Testament is another. I think this verse actually reinforces the fact that this was Christ's law is the same as God's law. Verse 22, Christ and God, of course, are one. And this was the fourth category, sensitive Gentiles. So now you had Gentiles that were Judaizers, very legalistic. You had Gentiles who were very barbaric, they were lawless. Now you have another category of Gentiles. They just got whatever it is that they've got, that they're sensitive to, that their conscience is sensitive to. And when I'm with Gentiles that have sensitive consciences in anything, I become sensitive to whatever they are sensitive to, that I might win more of these sensitive, conscious Gentiles. As I looked up the Greek words, I felt this was the spirit of these words. And that's why I paraphrased it this way. It's a fourth category that Paul does identify. And if I was going to identify it with one word, it'd be some that have a special conscience in one area or another. So you'll be around some people, maybe it doesn't have anything to do with food, maybe it's movies, maybe it's drink, maybe it's alcohol. There's some Christians that it's a sin to drink alcohol. If I'm with those Christians, I can assure you, I don't have anything to do with alcohol. There's others that think it's a sin almost if you don't. And so I'm happy to drink alcohol with them, except I won't violate the law of God, which is you're not to get drunk. So I would be careful not to violate the law of God, but I would identify with them. And in fact, you see, most of us here, we really don't know what that means. Until you travel to other countries or live in other countries, you'd be shocked. The food's different. The customs are different. There's Christians, I grew up with Christians that wouldn't have a deck of cards in their house. No deck of cards. That it was a sin. Well, look, I didn't push cards on them. I didn't have anything to do with cards because that was their conscience. I was with some Christians that if they walked into a restaurant and there was any alcohol served or on the menu, they would get up and march right out of that restaurant. Well, I would march right out of the restaurant with them. I don't have to use my liberty. That's sin if I do that. You go to Europe, however, and there's many Christians in Europe that, they drink alcohol like water, and they don't think anything of it. And many American Christians that thought alcohol was a sin go over there, and they're not effective as winning people to Christ because they forgot to read 1 Corinthians 9 and thinking, oh, it's a sin. Well, Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine. And so he certainly didn't have any problem with that. But he does say, not to get intoxicated. So that's where this verse comes in. So I can be with the lawless, or I can be with sensitive Gentiles, whatever their likes or dislikes are. And if you're not this way, then you're thinking of yourself. You're not winning. The most important thing in your life is to win people to Christ. Because when we die, let's just say we were all gassed. I mean, a nuke war happened today and we go to heaven. The only thing any of us in this room will ever have with us is anybody we affected for Jesus Christ. Either that we won to Christ or that we encouraged in some way in Christ. That's all that's going to be with us in heaven. There's not even going to be marriage or given in marriage. We're all going to be like the bride of Christ. And so Paul is, he's got the vision, and this is why God used him so much and why he was so effective all over the world. So he says, when I'm with the Gentiles that have sensitive consciences in anything, I become sensitive to whatever they're sensitive to so that I might win more of these sensitive, conscious Gentiles. Whatever it is. As long as it's not sin, we can do it, can't we? As long as it doesn't violate the law of God or the law of Christ. And then here's the last one, or the fourth one, for people. He finally concludes, everyone, I will become like everyone else, so that in every way I might win and save everyone I can. So notice all the areas. Starts out with Jews, Judaized Gentiles, lawless Gentiles, sensitive, conscious Gentiles. Now, if we've missed anybody, he says, whoever they are, I'll become like whoever it is so that I might win. So when you're around people, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, next week, how are you? Many people say, well, that's not me. I mean, this, I'm going to be me. To be me is to be in the flesh. God saved you from yourself to make you a new person. You say, oh, that's not me. You need to be like Christ, no longer like me. I don't want to be like me. I want to be like Christ. Paul, it said, follow me even as I follow Christ. That's what love is to identify with others, to be like them, because I don't want anything to be a barrier for me to influence them for good. Or to see them obviously saved if they're not a Christian. So everyone, whoever it is, that I might win everyone I can. Now he hits one last category in verse 23. Now he talks about everything. This is interesting. Everything I do is to win people to the gospel and share the good news. So now he talked about all categories of people. Now he talks about all categories of activity. All activity. Whatever I do. That's pretty all-encompassing, wouldn't you say? Well, that's the standard. Everything I do is to win people to the gospel and share the good news. I don't know about you guys, but this had a powerful effect in my life when I was younger in my teens, and God got a hold of this in my life. And so, because I had a longing desire to win people to Christ. See, if you don't want to win people to Christ, this is not relevant to you. This has no bearing on you. These verses are zero to you. Unless you want to win somebody. Unless you want to win somebody. You know, people that are in sales, for example, an insurance salesman or some kind of a salesman, they know these principles. Because these principles apply in influencing anybody. A salesman doesn't come in your house and offend you. They identify with you as much as they can, don't they? Because they want to sell their insurance to you or whatever their product is. Go to a used car or an automobile dealer down here. And I've gone into them many times, and they'll find out what they do. And they'll just try to identify with you as much as they can. Because they want to sell you a car. If they do it to sell a car, shouldn't we do it to make the message of Jesus Christ attractive? Shouldn't we do it for Jesus' sake? Anybody have any thoughts or questions or confusion or anything to add to any of these verses? Any thoughts? No thoughts?
Where does the Gentiles come from in verse 22?
Well, he just talks about the Jews, and I'd have to go back to the actual text. But I think after the Jews here in verse 20, then it's everyone else after that is Gentiles. Everyone after that is other people. It's never again Jews. They're always the Jews, for example. You said 22.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Jews wouldn't be considered lawless in general. They were the ones that were generally, following the law. And so I think after it talks about the Jews, I think everybody else then is in the Gentile camp. Because there's only Jews or Gentiles. Those are the only two categories of people.
Are we more like Judaized Gentiles or lawless Gentiles? I'm serious.
Well,
what would I be? What would you be?
Well, in some ways, we're not like any of these, are we?
Not really.
See, these are all people that don't have Christ. What's the word that's used there, Andrew? Do you have the...
It just says, when I'm with those who are weak, I share the weakness, but I want to bring the weak to Christ.
Yeah. In verse 22.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, as I looked up the word, I felt the word related to people that have different weakness or conscience, and they were sensitive. And some of the other translations use that as well, that have a real conscience about something versus some that don't have a conscience about things. So I took the idea of it being somebody that's sensitive to something that they don't need to be. There's a lot of people that are real sensitive in different areas, and it's a weakness. And we might think, hey, you don't need to be that way, but they feel that way. So it's my paraphrase of what I think that word is getting at.
Some little related is in Romans 14. Same word is used for weak, astenos, which means not strong. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. One who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. But it associates here weak. The one who is weak eats vegetables only, and it's same word, same word that's used.
I guess I also attribute with kind of like weak, or somebody had a sensitive conscience, but never just with Gentiles.
So you think it could be Jews too?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it could be.
Yeah.
But
Just somebody with a weak conscience, it doesn't matter.
These are people that are very easily offended.
easily offended people.
Honestly, I think, at least in the Old Testament, it seems like the Jews would be more easily offended than the Gentiles. Or more sensitive.
Yeah, well, some might be. So you could just say ones that have a sensitive conscience to something. I tend to think it's referring to Gentiles because he goes to the lawless Gentiles and the others. And I think he kind of leaves the Jews in verse 20, but whether it's Jews or Gentiles, it's still somebody that has a conscience that's, feels you can't do this or you can't do that. Or maybe like John said, somebody that's easily offended. But it's the main thing is, it's interesting to see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories that he does talk about of people. I think that's kind of interesting.
But I mean, in Romans 14, the same principle is applying here, and he's talking about vegetarianism as an example, and essentially what he's saying is, you have liberty to eat meat, but don't sit there and throw down a slab of steak in front of your vegetarian brother. Now he's talking in this case about a brother in the Lord who's weak, someone who's already saved, but the principle is the same. In this case, you're not to stumble your brother that may be weaker because they don't feel they have the liberty that Christ has given you. But the word weak is used in the same context here, and it's a very similar thought. Okay,
Yeah, that's good. Here he talks a lot about winning at times. So
different purpose, but similar.
But it could be winning Christians to be able to influence them and edify them and build them up, or it could be to win them to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts or additions that some might have?
Sometimes when you relate to someone, then the next thing you say is more relevant. So my boss that sells 10 times more than me, he doesn't talk about what he's selling. He immediately goes, "Where are you from?" and starts talking about them until he finds a commonality. And then once he can relate to them and he finds what they're saying is relevant, then they find what he's saying is relevant, and then he doesn't even need to sell the product. It sells itself just like that. So.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting how salespeople that are trying to sell a product, like you said, are so much more sensitive to these principles than Christians. And Christians are so oftentimes arrogant. Well, that's me. I can do what I want. This is in the context of liberty. And we saw earlier where Paul says all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things are edifying. They don't build up. So Paul was not thinking what liberty you might have. He was thinking what opportunity you might have by becoming all things to all people, that by all means you might save some. That's the goal.
Well, I think it's a lot more natural with love. Because I remember before I knew anything about sales, although just Christ coming into my life, just being able to connect with all different kinds of people in different walks of life and loving them naturally and really connecting with people just easily instead of just by the law being like, okay, I'm going to try to do this sales trick, try to find their hot button, try to do step by step. Because that's not authentic, and so if you're really want to do it with the right motives and the right way, God will naturally actually bring you there. And so I think that should be the goal. It's not this is how you do it, sales way. This is how a car salesperson does it. And so it has nothing to do with that. It's getting your heart in the right place, and then it'll just overflow.
Yeah, that's good. Well, that's what he said earlier here.
Well, yeah, Paul is explaining the process of what's going on.
Right.
All that's not like, oh, we should all the more be better salesmen than car salesmen. Your focus should not be on that. Your focus should be on Christ, and then all of a sudden, because you're looking through His eyes and He loved that person, then you can connect to that person. If your focus is on connecting with the person, God can't touch his heart nearly as much as you. Inside your effort, and all your effort is not good enough. And so I think that can be a problem with thinking too much about trying to be a good salesperson.
Yeah. I think what Paul's getting to, yeah, that's absolutely correct, Mark. What Paul's getting to here, I think, is this is what he's sacrificing. He's sacrificing to be a Jew with the Jews, or ultimately to be all things to all men. Okay, it's a sacrifice, and he's saying this is what the sacrifice you have to be willing to take. There's a little saying, kind of like another one. Nobody cares unless they know that you care. Okay, it's kind of like along what you're saying there.
They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Right? I think that's what you're trying to say, right?
Well,
Go ahead.
don't be misunderstood. What I'm saying is that car salesmen will many times sacrifice more to sell a car than a believer is willing to sacrifice themselves to win people to Christ. And that's what I'm saying is it's really sad that we don't have the love, as you're saying, Mark, to become all things to all people, that by all means we might see some saved. And it's and many of us oftentimes don't think of being genuine is sometimes a misnomer, and say, well, I want to be genuine, meaning I don't want to be flexible and identify or be a servant or a slave to this person. I want to be me. And Paul clearly makes it clear that he became all things to everybody. So we want to be genuine, but it's not ungenuine. In fact, it's the most loving thing to do, to not hold out our distinctions, but rather to identify with whoever we're sharing with. I think these points really, this is love in action. Many times we use the word love. We just need to love. But we don't have God's definition of love. Paul gives some specific things here with love. He says, if you love, you'll be a slave. You'll be a servant to others. If you love, you'll become like a Jew to the Jews. If you love, you'll become like a Judaized Gentile to those Gentiles. If you love, you'll to the lawless, you'll become lawless. or to the weak, or I put sensitive Gentile there. Of course, it could be a Jew. You'll be weak to that person.
Well, okay, it depends on what you call genuine. So what's genuine about Paul here? Okay, that's not compromised.
It's love for Christ.
I mean, it says God weighs the motives, and I believe that it's actually when my heart's in the right place, I can really be genuinely connecting with someone with Christ in my life. Of course, I can try to push it and be unauthentic without it, and also I've worked sales before, and sometimes you can work it that way, but lots of times people see right through that. Yeah. And so it's like you have to be genuinely listening and connecting with them and reaching out and wanting to reach their heart, and so that's a big difference between that and a car salesman that just wants to sell a car.
Yeah. Now the car salesman is doing it for his own self-gain.
Yeah.
Well, what's genuine about Paul here, why I asked that question is he desires to bless as many as he can, okay, by them receiving the gospel, by winning them, because he knows that they receive with life, and he'll do whatever it takes to achieve that end. Is what's happened. So even though he's saying I'll do these things, okay, the whole goal, what's in his heart, is to win them to Christ so that they may have life. So he does care, okay, and he'll subordinate everything else to it, short of actually violating, the Lord Himself.
Yeah. Although He cares for the person, and that's why He wants to win them.
So in the context of a salesman, now if you have a product that really will bless that person, you're not a used car salesman. I mean, you're trying to sell something that you know, okay, they'll be really happy about, okay. Then you can be genuine in that kind of way and still sell it. But the bottom line is, one thing Paul will not change in any of this is his genuineness in his heart to see people won to Christ, okay, and that will not be compromised. That's his genuineness. That's the part of him that's being genuine here.
And I would say also genuine, John, is we're genuine if we don't violate God's law.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the law of Christ. That's where we want to be genuine. And of course, the law of Christ is to love, is to not have a selfish motive. And Paul, we knew Paul was genuine because he said that's what he boasted in the fact that he wouldn't take money. He didn't take pay, and that's why nobody could ever condemn him that he had an ulterior motive like a car salesman, because he didn't say you pay me and I'll preach to you. No, he preached whether they shared with him or not, so they could never question his motive. And that's the reason he said to the Gentiles, the Corinthians here, that he said, I would rather die. Remember that verse further up? Where was that verse where he was talking about that? He talked to
15 there.
Yeah,
I'd rather die.
Right at the end of 15. But I've never used my title right or ever asked anybody for their tithe money for all my preaching and teaching. And be sure I'm not writing this now so you or anybody will give me anything.